All right, let's dive into this one. We're taking a deep dive into the making of GoldenEye from 1995, uncovering behind-the-scenes stuff, themes, and how it fits in the Bond world. We've got a good mix of sources for this one. A film analysis from the Flick Lab podcast, some background from Wikipedia and TV tropes, and even Roger Ebert's review.
A diverse bunch, yeah. That should give us a pretty well-rounded view, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so GoldenEye came out in 1995, right? Just a few years after the Soviet Union collapsed. But even though the Cold War was, like, technically over, the film is still kind of steeped in that whole vibe. It's like anxieties, imagery, the whole thing.
It really captures that feeling of the world kind of fumbling into a new era, doesn't it?
Yeah, totally.
It's like the ghost of the Cold War is still hanging around. Even the pre-title sequence throws us back to 1986.
Oh, yeah.
Almost like it's emphasizing this idea of transition, you know? Was it playing on nostalgia for that era, do you think? Or more about the uncertainty of what came next? What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wonder if it was tapping into both, maybe. Like, on one hand, you've got that familiar, almost comforting structure of the Cold War. But then on the other hand, there's this underlying fear. Like, what happens when that structure disappears?
Right, right.
What happens then?
And that fear is definitely in the film. You
Yeah.
see it in Trevelyan's whole deal, right?
Yeah.
His anger at being abandoned by the West speaks to that larger anxiety about the shifting global landscape.
For sure, for sure. And speaking of shifts, GoldenEye also marks a pretty big one for the Bond franchise itself. This is where Pierce Brosnan steps in as 007. New era. And they really wanted to, I mean, they clearly wanted to distance him from Timothy Dalton, even using those, like, strategic camera angles early on, kind of obscure Brosnan's face, you know?
Yeah, it was a deliberate choice, wasn't it? To make a clean break visually and everything. I mean, the filmmakers were responding to some of the criticism about, the way women were portrayed in the older Bond films. And they wanted to present a more modern Bond, less overtly sexist, Do you think they pulled it off?
Well, it's complicated, right? And I think GoldenEye kind of reflects that. I mean, there's definitely an attempt to give the female characters more agency. Natalia's no damsel in distress.
Right.
That's for sure. But some of those old tropes are still there. I mean, we'll get into that later. But what's interesting is how Brosnan kind of navigates this whole shift, He's got that classic Bond charm, for sure, but with, like, a bit more depth, I think. Maybe even vulnerability than we'd seen before.
Yeah, I agree. He brings a certain sensitivity, especially with Natalia. Like, he's aware of his flaws and the issues with his lifestyle.
Right.
That adds a whole other dimension, that introspection.
Totally. Okay, can we talk about that bungee jump off the Contra Dam?
Oh, man. It's incredible. That wasn't CGI, right? That was a real stunt. One take.
Wow.
They did it in one take.
That's commitment to practical effects right there. They could easily CGI'd that.
Oh, yeah.
But there's something about seeing Brosnan actually doing it, Raw, authentic, sets the tone for the whole movie. This is Bond pushing his limits.
Physically, mentally.
And then there's that tank chase through St. Petersburg.
Oh, yeah. Epic.
I mean, part of it was actually filmed on location, which is amazing enough. But then they recreated sections of St. Petersburg on a runway in England.
Wow. The logistics of that.
I know, right?
Mind-boggling.
And they even swapped out the tank's steel tracks with rubber ones so they wouldn't damage the actual streets.
Wow.
That attention to detail is insane.
Respect for the city.
Right. Exactly. But of course, you can't have a Bond film without memorable characters. And GoldenEye doesn't disappoint. Famke Janssen as Xenia Onatopp.
Oh, yeah, iconic.
I mean, come on, seductive, deadly, and with that, well, let's just say unique characteristic.
Right. Memorable for sure. But whether that unique characteristic is empowering or just plays into stereotypes, that's something to think about, isn't it?
Yeah, it's true. It's a complex portrayal and one that probably wouldn't fly today.
Probably not.
Then you've got Alan Cumming as Boris, the, archetypal computer hacker.
Oh, yeah, Boris.
Almost a caricature, but he brings so much humor to it.
Oh, yeah, he's great. Comic relief for sure. But there's also that underlying menace with Boris, isn't there?
Yeah.
He represents that emerging cyber warfare threat.
Right.
Adds that contemporary relevance.
Totally. And his back and forth with Bond about Boris's skills is just gold. It's such a great running gag.
Oh, absolutely.
And it kind of subtly points to how technology was becoming, huge in the world of espionage.
Yeah, it doesn't shy away from that. GoldenEye is very much of its time,
Yeah.
And I think that's part of its appeal.
For sure. For sure. Now let's talk about some of the homages and inspirations woven into the film. That scene where Bond and Trevelyan meet in the statue park, it was inspired by a real place.
Really?
Yeah, a real dumping ground for Soviet statues in St. Petersburg.
Fascinating. Using a real-world location to shape the film's aesthetic adds that layer of authenticity. Almost like unsettling, like those discarded relics of a bygone era are still, like, haunting the present.
Yeah, for sure. And there's that scene where Bond sees a vision of Xenia in the helicopter. That's a direct homage to Apocalypse Now.
Oh, wow. Two iconic films linked by a visual motif. For those in the know, it adds that extra layer, doesn't it? Wonder, was it intentional, drawing parallels between Bond and the protagonists of other war films?
Oh, I like that. Could be suggesting that even with all the suaveness, is also dealing with the psychological toll of his job.
Exactly. And that ties into the film's bigger themes: betrayal, revenge.
Yeah.
Things that take it beyond just a typical action movie. Adds a moral complexity that still resonates today.
Yeah, definitely.
We'll get into that more deeply. But
yeah, let's dig into that next, for sure.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Yeah, so Alec Trevelyan, his motivations are really interesting. It's all rooted in this deep sense of betrayal. Personal and historical, really. Stemming from his family's past, the Leon's Cossacks.
Right, for those who don't know. The Leon's Cossacks were a group who collaborated with the Axis powers during World War II, hoping to gain independence from the Soviet Union. They were promised asylum by the British, but that promise was broken.
Yeah, tragically. The British ended up repatriating many of them, including Trevelyan's family, back to the Soviet Union, where they faced persecution, even death. It's this historical trauma that really shapes Trevelyan, doesn't it? Fuels his revenge against the West.
Yeah, it makes him a much more compelling villain than just your typical power-hungry bad guy. You understand his anger, even if you don't agree with his methods.
Absolutely.
He's a product of his experiences,
right,
and that makes him truly dangerous.
He's like a dark reflection of Bond in a way.
Yeah.
Both skilled agents, both betrayed by people they trusted, but their paths diverge.
Yeah.
Trevelyan chooses the dark side.
Consumed by hatred.
Yeah.
And it's interesting how the film plays with that idea of mirroring, Trevelyan even says to Bond, "We're both orphans." Chilling line. Like a reminder that they have this shared past, but their choices have led them to very different places.
Right. There's a real moral complexity there.
Yeah.
Elevates it beyond good versus evil, Makes you confront some uncomfortable truths about history and betrayal.
For sure. And that complexity extends to Bond himself. He's not portrayed as this flawless hero.
No.
M even calls him out, right? Sexist, misogynist dinosaur. Directly confronting the criticisms that had been aimed at the franchise for years.
Bold move. Holding Bond accountable for his past, recognizing that the character needs to change with the times. But the question is, does he really change? Or is it just surface-level stuff? What do you think?
It's a good question. I think there's evidence for both sides. On one hand, he does have those moments of genuine respect with Natalia, even vulnerability. But then on the other hand, there are still those elements of the old Bond, using women as tools for his missions.
Right, that tension. It's what makes GoldenEye so fascinating to analyze. Caught between the past and the present, trying to find that balance.
Totally. And that balancing act extends to other parts of the film, too. The music, for example. Eric Serra, who did Leon, the Professional, composed the score. But there were some issues, apparently.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it seems like the producers weren't totally happy with his initial score. They felt like it lacked that classic Bond sound. So they brought in John Altman to add some more traditional orchestral elements.
Interesting.
So it's like that blend of new and familiar again. And Altman actually composed the version of the James Bond theme, the one that plays during the gun barrel sequence.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a clever way to bridge the gap, right?
Yeah, clearly.
Give the fans that taste of the classic Bond, but also introduce something fresh. And speaking of the classic Bond, one element that was definitely updated was Dame Judi Dench brought a completely different energy to the character.
Absolutely.
Strong, authoritative, doesn't hesitate to challenge Bond.
Right. Such a departure from the more passive M we'd seen before. Dench is M. She's a force.
Total force.
Bond's
equal.
More than equal.
Yeah, maybe even his superior. Their dynamic is great.
Electric.
And it's interesting. Casting a woman as M was kind of controversial at the time.
Really?
Yeah, some people felt like it was betraying tradition. But looking back, it's hard to imagine anyone else in the role. Dench's M became so iconic. I mean, they kept the character female even when the franchise rebooted with Daniel Craig.
Wow, that says it all, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. Now, let's talk about the critical reception of GoldenEye. Roger Ebert made some interesting observations about the film's self-awareness.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Well, he noted that it felt like Both Bond and the villain were aware of the genre's tropes and cliches, almost like they were winking at the audience.
I like that.
Yeah, and he even coined the term talking killer in his little movie glossary. For villains who just monologue endlessly about their evil plans, instead of just getting on with it.
Uh-huh. That's so true. It's like they can't resist explaining their whole scheme in detail.
Right, and it highlights how GoldenEye was trying to subvert some of those expectations, while still delivering the thrills.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance.
It is.
But I think it works. It's a self-aware film, aware of its history, but not afraid to poke fun at itself.
And overall, the critical reception was pretty positive. Lots of reviewers praised it for bringing Bond into a more modern context. Rotten Tomatoes even gives it an 80% approval rating.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, pretty solid. The consensus seems to be that it's high-tech, action-packed, sophisticated.
Yeah, that's about right.
But of course, not everyone loved it. Some critics, like Richard Schickel from Time, felt like the Bond conventions were getting a bit stale.
Yeah, I could see that. After so many years, the formula can wear a bit thin.
Right. Even with the modernization, some felt like it couldn't escape its past.
But despite those criticisms, it's still held up pretty well, hasn't it?
Yeah, its reputation has only grown over time, often ranked as Brosnan's best Bond film. And a fan favorite, for sure.
Yeah, and the Flick Lab podcast made an interesting point about how Brosnan brought back that sense of familiarity to the role. After the more serious tone of Dalton's Bond, audiences were ready for that classic charm again. The wit. Brosnan just embodies that so well.
Yeah, I think that's a key part of its appeal. It felt like a homecoming, a reminder of what people loved about Bond, but also hinting at a new direction for the character.
That balance of nostalgia and innovation, right? That's what makes it so enduring.
For sure. Okay, I gotta ask, what are your thoughts on that infamous line? She always did enjoy a good squeeze. Yeah, it hasn't aged well, has it?
Ooh, yeah, that one's a bit rough. A reminder that even films that try to modernize can still trip up on those outdated tropes. And problematic language shows how much our understanding of gender dynamics and consent has changed since then.
It's a shame because in a lot of ways, GoldenEye did try to portray its female characters as more complex.
Yeah, it did.
More capable.
Than in previous Bond films, for sure.
It's a reminder that progress isn't always a straight line, right?
Yeah, even well-intentioned films can reflect the blind spots of their time.
Definitely. But let's move on to something a bit more positive. The humor in GoldenEye. It's one of the things that makes it so rewatchable. The banter between Bond and Q, for example.
Oh, yeah, that's always a highlight.
Like that classic line, Q shows Bond the exploding pen, says, "Don't say it," and Bond just replies, "The writing's on the wall."
Haha, classic. That dry wit.
So good. And there's that scene where Bond and Natalia are shopping for computers, and the sound of her Hunt and Peck typing is like amplified.
Oh, yeah, that's funny.
It's such a subtle touch, but it adds to the humor.
Gives it a more human feel,
Amidst all the action and espionage.
For sure.
And of course, Alan Cumming as Boris.
Oh, Boris.
So over the top.
He's great.
I am invincible.
Aha, love it.
The perfect foil to Bond.
Absolutely.
Speaking of over the top, did you know the original ending was supposed to be even more explosive?
Really? What was it going to be?
So apparently, director Martin Campbell wanted the helicopter to blow up, the one Bond and Natalia escape in.
Wow, that would have been something.
Right, talk about going out with a bang. It's a shame they didn't go with it, although maybe a bit too much, even for Bond.
Yeah, maybe a bit over the top.
But before we move on, there's another interesting detail from the film. GoldenEye is the first Bond film to explicitly mention Bond's parents.
Oh, that's right.
They're dead, of course.
Of course.
But it adds a layer to his character, doesn't it? Suggests that even the seemingly invincible secret agent, he's shaped by loss and trauma.
Yeah, it makes him more human.
And it's interesting that this element was explored more in the Daniel Craig films. It's like GoldenEye planted the seeds for a more introspective Bond.
Interesting how choices in one film can influence an entire franchise.
Right, the ripple effect. Okay, now I'm curious to get your take on the love story in GoldenEye. It's a bit unconventional for a Bond film.
You mean because Natalia Simonova is a computer programmer?
Exactly. Not your typical Bond girl. She's not a glamorous model or seductive spy. She's brilliant, resourceful, uses her intellect to help Bond save the day.
Yeah, it's a nice change.
Refreshing.
She's his intellectual equal. Their relationship feels more grounded, more realistic.
And there's that scene on the train where they share a quiet moment. And she challenges his lifestyle,
Oh, yeah, that's a good scene.
Points out the loneliness, the emotional detachment.
It's a rare moment of vulnerability for Bond, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
He's forced to confront the emotional cost of his job, the sacrifices he makes.
Yeah, it humanizes him.
In a way we don't always see.
Even a larger-than-life character like Bond. He has feelings, you know. He can be affected by loss and trauma.
And that scene speaks to the film's exploration of duality, I think. Bond and Trevelyan, they're both products of their pasts, shaped by betrayal and loss. But Bond chooses heroism, even if it's flawed, while Trevelyan succumbs to the darkness.
Right, it's a powerful message about the choices we make.
And the consequences.
Exactly. One of the things that makes GoldenEye so resonant, it's crazy how influential the GoldenEye video game was. I mean, it's considered a classic, right? Really helped solidify that whole first-person shooter genre on consoles.
Yeah, totally. It's amazing how a film can spawn a game. That becomes just as iconic, sometimes even more so.
It's true, and it's funny you should mention that, because the Flick Lab podcast actually made a point about how GoldenEye itself was kind of influenced by video games. They argue that the action sequences, especially the tank chase and that final battle in the satellite dish, they have this like video game-like feel to them.
That's interesting. Yeah, I can see that. Those clear objectives, the escalating challenges, the sense of progression through different levels. It's almost like they were borrowing from video games on purpose.
Right. And it makes sense. I mean, video games were getting huge in the 90s, so it's another way GoldenEye reflects that whole cultural landscape.
Definitely. Definitely. A film very much in dialogue with the trends of the mid-90s.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about the visual style of GoldenEye. Brosnan's Bond is so stylish, right? Those suits, the gadgets, it's such a distinct look. I read that they really wanted to give him that air of international sophistication.
Yeah, the Flick Lab podcast interviewed Matt Spazer for this one. He runs the website The Suits of James Bond, like a real expert on Bond's wardrobe. And he talked about how they deliberately moved away from that more traditional British tailoring. You know, the kind we saw with the previous Bond.
Yeah.
Brosnan's suits are Italian-inspired, sleek, modern, reflecting his role as this global agent operating in a world that's changing so fast.
Right, like a visual cue that this is a Bond for a new era.
Exactly.
A more cosmopolitan Bond.
Yeah, and Spazer also pointed out the interesting use of color in Brosnan's clothes.
Oh, yeah, like what?
He said they often combine cool and warm tones, creating this balanced, neutral look.
Interesting.
It's different from the, stark color contrasts in some of the older films.
Huh. It's fascinating how those little details add up, right? And create that visual consistency.
Yeah, totally. And it's not just the suits. Spazer also talked about how they put Bond in more tactical gear sometimes, especially in the opening and the finale.
Right. That's a change from the classic image of Bond.
Yeah, the suave gentleman spy.
This Bond gets his hands dirty.
Exactly. He's not just a smooth operator. He's highly skilled, resourceful.
And that fits with the more action-heavy approach of GoldenEye, too. The bungee jump, the tank chase, all the hand-to-hand combat.
Totally. This Bond is ready for anything.
So as we wrap up our deep dive on GoldenEye, I think it's safe to say it holds up really well. Entertaining, stylish, and it makes you think, even after all these years.
I agree. It strikes that balance. Nostalgia and innovation honors the legacy of Bond, but pushes it forward, too.
And it still sparks conversation and debate like we've seen today.
It's a film that keeps people talking, across generations.
We covered a lot today. History, production, characters, critical reception. But the best way to appreciate GoldenEye is to watch it.
Absolutely. Go see it for yourself.
And watch it with a critical eye. Think about how the themes resonate today. How the portrayal of women has evolved.
Or haven't evolved.
Right. And appreciate how GoldenEye paved the way for the Bond we have now.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Hope you learned something new, and maybe it'll inspire you to revisit GoldenEye with a fresh perspective.
Until next time, keep exploring and keep asking questions.